The census numbers arrived on a gray morning in late autumn, when the oaks at the edge of Ashenveld's forest had gone copper and the first hard frost had silvered the grass in the lower yards. My master of wolves, dressed, brought the ledger himself rather than sending a page, which told me before he opened his mouth that something was wrong. 17 pups unaccounted for, he said. I looked at the number. Dressed ran the tightest den records in 3 kingdoms. He did not misplace pups. Missing or dead? Neither. He set the ledger on my table and turned it so I could read his notations in the margin. They're present at every head count, but they're not in any of the dens. They're leaving at night and returning before dawn. Healthy, well-fed actually. He paused. Better fed than the den records would account for. I closed the ledger. Where are they going? That's what I haven't written down, Dressed said. I thought you should see it first. We rode out before the noon hour, just the 2 of us. North along the tree line, where the pack territory met the old growth. The wolves watched us from the shadows as we passed. Not alarmed, just attentive, the way they always were when I rode through the outer range. I knew every wolf in Ashenveld by sight. I had made it my practice since the first year of my reign, walking the dens in the early morning, learning the faces and the family lines, knowing which pups had been whelped in which season, and who had survived the hard winters. They were mine to protect. I took that responsibility the way I took all of my responsibilities, completely, without reservation, as the cost of the authority I held. The cottage appeared at the edge of a clearing where 3 old oaks had grown together into a kind of arch. It was a small place, stone-walled, low-roofed, with a yard enclosed by a rough-hewn fence that was more suggestion than barrier. The gate stood open. In the yard, in the pale autumn light, 17 wolf pups were asleep. They were piled on one another in the boneless way of young wolves, legs and tails and blunt noses pointing in every direction, arranged around and upon a woman who sat in the yard's single wooden chair with a pup cradled in the crook of each arm, and 3 more draped across her lap. She was not sleeping. She was watching us approach with the calm of someone who had heard us coming from the moment we left the tree line. She was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years more. It was difficult to say. Dark-haired, wearing a linen work dress and a heavy wool shawl the color of ash bark. Her hands, where they curved under the sleeping pups, were capable and unhurried. She did not stand when we stopped at the fence line. She did not speak first. She simply looked at me, with gray eyes that were neither frightened nor defiant, and waited. These are pack wolves, I said. I know. Her voice was quiet but carried easily. The 2 gray ones against the fence are from the Northden litter. Their mother died in the 3rd storm. The spotted one on my left came in alone about 6 weeks ago. No litter mates that I could find. The others I can tell you one by one, if you like. Dressed looked at me. I looked at the pups, then at the woman. How long has this been happening? The first one came in the spring, she said. I reported it to the pack steward. He told me the wolf was likely abandoned and I should return it to the dens or drive it off. She considered the sleeping animal in her arm. I couldn't drive it off. It was 4 weeks old and had been alone for at least 3 days. So I kept it, and I sent another letter to the steward. He didn't reply. She shifted the pup slightly, with the practiced ease of someone who has held many. After the 3rd or 4th, I stopped writing letters and started keeping better records myself, in case anyone asked. She said it without reproach. She was not telling me she had been wronged. She was giving me the relevant information in the order it was relevant. I found I was studying her more carefully than I had studied the wolves. You have a license for wolf keeping? I asked. No, she said, entirely evenly. I applied for one in the spring. The steward, Garvin, told me the land I'm on is pack territory and I have no standing to hold a license. He sent removal notices 3 times. She glanced at the yard around her. I've complied each time. I pack up and the wolves follow me. We've moved twice. This is the 3rd location. A pause. I realize that may not be what you wanted to hear. It was not what I had wanted to hear, but not for the reason she probably thought. I looked at Dressed. He was keeping his expression carefully neutral, which meant he had opinions he was saving for the ride back. I looked at the woman again, at the 17 pups she had fed through 4 seasons and 2 moves, at the gate she left open, at the chair she sat in as though she had nowhere else to be. What is your name? I asked. Saren, she said. I came to Ashenveld 3 years ago from Fenside. I have no pack affiliation. She said the last part without apology. The way you state the color of your hair. I rent this land from the millwright in Ashenveld village. Or I did, until the last removal notice. The notice stands, I said, because that was the rule, and I needed to think before I suspended any rule. But it is suspended pending review. Stay where you are. She looked at me for a moment with those steady gray eyes. Then she nodded, once, and looked back down at the pup in her arm, which had begun to squirm. She shifted it competently, and it stilled. I rode back with dressed in something that was not quite silence. The pups are healthy? I said, when we were clear of the tree line. Thriving. He said it the way he'd say a difficult fact. Better condition than the den-raised litter from the same period, if I'm being honest. You're always being honest. Yes. A pause. Garvin has sent her 3 removal notices, you said. I've only seen 1 in the records. I turned that over. Find the others. He nodded. We did not speak again until the hold came into sight, and then he said quietly, She knows their names, my lord. The individual wolves. She knows which litter they came from. I did not answer, but I thought about it for a long time that night. The review took 3 weeks, which was longer than it needed to take, and I knew why. Every time I sat down to examine the removal notices and the licensing records, I found a reason to ride to the tree line instead. To check on the census numbers, I told myself. To verify the pup's condition, to ensure the pack wolves were not becoming habituated to a human residence in a way that would complicate the spring hunts. The reasons were legitimate, they were also excuses, and I was self-aware enough to know the difference. Saren never seemed surprised to see me. She would look up from whatever she was doing, building a better shelter for the pups along the fence line, boiling a grain mash in a battered pot over the fire, stitching a tear in one of her wool blankets with the patient industry of someone who has mended the same garment many times. And she would meet my eyes and wait for me to state my business, and then she would answer my questions with the same clear, unhurried economy she had used the first day. She did not try to impress me. She did not try to manage me. She did not soften her assessments when I might have preferred softer ones. When I asked her how the pup from the Northden litter was progressing, she told me it was gaining weight well, but had a crooked rear leg from its early days alone, and it would likely always favor the left when it ran. And she had adjusted its exercise accordingly. She said all of this with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. The pup was not a problem to be solved. It was an individual animal with a specific situation that required a specific accommodation. She had made it, without complaint, without ceremony. I began, around the end of the 2nd week, to stay longer than the census required. The excuse I gave myself was that the pup census was more complex than it appeared on paper. There were questions of which animals were stable enough to return to the formal dens, and those questions benefited from observation over time. This was true. It was not the full truth. The full truth was that Saren was interesting in the way that very few people I encountered were interesting. Not because she was attempting to interest me, which most people in my presence were, consciously or not, but because she simply was herself, entirely and without self-consciousness, and the self she was turned out to be worth paying attention to. She had opinions about wolf behavior that I had not heard from any of my trained wolf keepers. She had a memory for individual animals that was precise and unsentimental. She noted what was working and what was not, without attaching her feelings to either. And she had a quality of attention that was, I realized slowly, quite rare. When she looked at you, she was actually looking. Not calculating, not performing, not waiting for an opening, looking. She also had no use for rank, which was unusual in a person speaking with a king, and which I found, to my own surprise, a relief. She disagreed with me twice in the first week alone, once about the appropriate age to return a wolf pup to formal den life, and once about whether the outer north path should be rerouted past the old mill, a question I raised by chance and which she had a considered opinion on from having walked that path through 3 seasons. In both cases she said plainly what she thought, and in both cases she was right, and I told her so, and she accepted it without the elaborate performance of being surprised that I agreed, which would have been the response of most people. She simply moved on to the next thing. I began to understand that this was how she was with everything. Direct, thorough, genuinely interested in the outcome rather than in how she appeared while discussing it. When one of the grapevine pups stopped eating for 2 days in the 3rd week, she told me about it in a manner that was worried but not panicked, described exactly what she had tried and what had worked and what had not, and then she asked me a question about the Grey Pine litter's family history that I was not certain any wolf keeper in the formal dens could have answered. I knew because I had made it my business to know the wolves. She had made it her business too, and the fact that no one had asked her to was simply not relevant to her. I would ask about the pups and she would tell me. Then I would ask about her time in Fenside. She was guarded about the personal details, but forthcoming about the landscape, the wolf populations in the south, the different temperament of the lowland packs. I had questions. She had answers. It was a natural arrangement, and I told myself that was all it was, and rode home each afternoon with the slightly unconvincing feeling of a man who is keeping a secret from himself. The wolves came while we talked. Not just the pups. The older wolves began appearing at the fence line in ones and twos. Adult animals, most of them ones I knew well. Fenwick with the notched ear, 3 of the Grey Pine females, the young male I had named Colt for the way he moved. They would settle outside the fence and watch. Not anxiously, with the deliberate attention of wolves who have decided to keep an eye on something. What struck me, watching them, was that they were not waiting for anything from Saren. They were not bringing injured feet or requesting food. They were simply near her, in the way that pack animals are near those they have claimed as their own, without urgency, without specific need, as a matter of belonging. I had spent 20 years with these wolves. I knew the difference between an animal presenting a problem and an animal making a choice. They had made a choice. All of them, one by one, in the unhurried way of creatures who are sure of what they know and see no reason to rush the announcement of it. "Do they come to you when I'm not here?" I asked her one afternoon, when Fenwick had been sitting outside the gate for the better part of an hour, apparently occupied with nothing in particular. Most of them, yes. She was working a knot out of the spotted pup's fur with careful fingers. The pup had gotten into something sticky near the water trough, and the process of disentanglement was painstaking and required the wolf to remain still, which it was managing tolerably. Not all at once. They come and go. Fenwick usually stays until after I've fed the pups in the evening, and then she goes. She glanced toward the fence. Brav came once, about a month ago. I went still at that. Brav was the oldest wolf in Ashenveld, perhaps the oldest wolf alive in the northern packs, though no one could say for certain. He was 2 centuries at least, immense, silver-furred, with yellow eyes that had seen more of the world than most men. He had been my grandfather's wolf companion, and my father's before I inherited the title. He moved through the hold and through the pack territory as a sovereign thing, outside the hierarchy and yet somehow above it. An animal so old that even the alphas gave way to him, not out of fear but out of the instinctive deference that age and certainty command. He had not taken a formal position of acknowledgement, not lain down, not bowed in the old way, not given the ancient signal of acceptance for a Luna. Since the death of Ashenveld's first queen, a woman I knew only from the portrait in the East Gallery. "He looked at you?" I said. "And at the pups." She glanced at me, catching something in my voice. "Is that significant?" "It may be," I said, and I did not say more than that, because I was still working through what I believed, and I was not a man who spoke before his thinking was finished. But I watched the fence line more carefully on the ride home, and I found myself thinking about Brav all the way back to the hold, and again that night, and again the next morning. Garvin found me in my study on the first day of the 4th week and asked, with the careful courtesy of a man who suspects he is on uncertain ground, whether the review of the removal notices had concluded. He was my pack steward, efficient, organized, proud of the orderliness of Ashenveld's formal records. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who believed deeply in the correctness of categories, and Saren did not fit his categories. No pack name, no license, no proper standing. Therefore, a problem to be resolved. I had worked with him for 12 years, and I knew that this was not the product of malice, but of a particular temperament that required the world to be organized, and felt genuinely unsettled when it was not. "The review is ongoing," I said. "The removal notices are suspended." He paused, adjusting. "The land she occupies is formally pack territory, my lord. There are precedents. The boundary agreements made in my lord's father's time specifically designated the North Tree Line as. Drest has reviewed the precedents." I set down the document I had been reading and looked at him. "Tell me about the letters." His expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. "My lord? Saren sent 3 letters in the spring. You received them. You replied to 1. I kept my voice even, Where are the other replies? A longer pause. The first letter described an abandoned wolf pup of uncertain origin. I judged it a routine matter and directed her to return it to the formal denning system or release it. And when she wrote again? By the second letter, the pup was established in her care. Removal at that stage would have caused distress to the animal. I determined the matter could wait. He met my eyes steadily. By the third letter, there were several animals. I determined that the most efficient resolution was the removal of the unlicensed keeper, which would return all the animals to the formal pack care system in one step. It seemed cleaner than a piecemeal arrangement. I see. I looked at him for a moment. And the 4 seasons during which she kept 17 pack wolves alive and healthy while waiting for a response, you find no merit in that record? He was quiet. He was a careful man, and he could hear in my tone that this was not a neutral question. The animals are in good condition, he allowed. That is not in dispute. No, I said, it is not. He waited, and when I did not continue, he said, very carefully, my lord has been riding to the north tree line with some frequency these past weeks. Yes, I said. Another pause. The council has noted it. I imagine they have. I met his eyes. Is there a question you'd like to ask directly, Garvin? He considered for a moment, and then, to his credit, he asked it. Is the woman at the tree line to have standing in this pack? Yes, I said, she is. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, I see, in a tone that suggested he was seeing several things at once and organizing his understanding of them. I will prepare the formal license. Thank you, I said. And the removal notices are formally dismissed. He nodded and left, and I suspect that the conversation he had with himself on the walk back to his office was a complicated one. But he was a man who reorganized his categories when the evidence required it. He would come around. I rode to the tree line that afternoon. I wanted to tell her that the removal notices were formally dismissed, that she would not be moved again. I wanted to see her face when I told her. It was not the reason a king rides out to deliver a routine administrative decision. I was aware of that. She was mending the fence when I arrived, replacing a post that had leaned over the winter, working with a mallet and a wedge of stone she had clearly found herself rather than sent for. She looked up when I dismounted, and then looked at the post, which needed one more strike to seat properly. Do you want me to? I began. I have it, she said, and drove the wedge home with 2 clean strokes. She set the mallet against the fence and straightened, turning to face me, brushing her hands against her skirt. Census? The removal notices are dismissed, I said, permanently. You have standing to remain on this land and to continue caring for pack wolves as needed. A formal license will be drawn up and delivered within the week. She looked at me for a long moment. I could not read exactly what was in her face. Not surprise, because she was rarely surprised by things, but something softer than her usual steady attention. Something that suggested the words had landed somewhere it mattered. Thank you, she said, simply. It should have been done in the spring, I said. I'm sorry it wasn't. She nodded, accepting the apology without making a ceremony of it. Then she glanced toward the yard, where 4 pups were tumbling over one another near the water trough. 2 of the gray pine litter are ready to return to the dens if Dressed wants them. They're old enough and they'll integrate well. The spotted one needs another month at least. Keep them as long as they need, I said. She looked back at me then. Really looked. The way she sometimes did. With that unhurried attention that felt less like being examined than being recognized. I had a strange sense, standing at her fence in the gray autumn light, of being known without being judged. It was not a feeling I was accustomed to. Most people in my presence were, even without intending it, managing me, shaping what they said and how they held themselves in response to what they thought I needed or wanted or feared. Saren did nothing of the kind. She looked at me and told me the truth and waited to hear what I had to say, and there was nothing between us but whatever was actually there. I stayed until the light began to fail. We talked about the gray pine litter and about the wolf populations in the high forest, and about whether the winter would be early this year, and I had the feeling the whole time of something settling into rightness, the way a stone settles when you find the level place where it belongs. And when I finally turned to go, she said, "Be careful on the north path. There's a drop on the east side they haven't repaired since the rains." She had said it the way she said everything. Practical, direct, without fuss. As though it were natural to worry about which path I was taking home. I thought about that all the way back to the hold, and I thought about it in the evening, and when Drest looked at me over his evening report with the expression of a man who has drawn a conclusion and is being respectful enough not to say it aloud, I did not enlighten him. I was not ready to say it aloud myself. The days shortened. The first real snow came and lay in the yard at the tree line, and Saren added a layer of hay to the pup shelter and banked the fire higher. I knew this because I was there when she did it, or rather, I arrived shortly after, with a question about the census that I had thought of on the ride over and forgotten by the time I dismounted. Drest had stopped asking about the census justifications. He had, instead, begun including a note in his morning reports about any pack wolves that had been observed moving toward the North Forest edge, a small, tactful accommodation that told me he had drawn his own conclusions and was supporting them in the only way that did not require him to say anything I had not said first. My counsel had not drawn conclusions yet, or if they had, they were keeping them to the private conversations I was not present for. Garvin had gone quiet on the subject of the removal notices and the licensing question, which I took to mean he was in the process of reorganizing his understanding of the situation. He would come to it. And the older wolves came more frequently now to the fence line. Not just Fenwick and the gray pine females. The senior wolves of the outer range, animals I had known for a decade, animals who were not in the habit of approaching human dwellings, were making their way to the north tree line and settling outside the fence in the patient way of wolves who are waiting for something to resolve itself. Saren noted their presence the way she noted all the wolf behavior, with interest and care, and without attaching more significance to it than she yet had reason to. She fed the pups and repaired the fence and laid in stores for the winter, and when I came she looked up with those steady gray eyes and made space for the conversation without making ceremony of it. The night Brav came again was clear and cold, the sky swept clean by a north wind that had been blowing since mid-morning. I had ridden out on a different errand entirely, a boundary dispute in the eastern fields that had required my presence and taken most of the day, and I was returning through the tree-line path because it was shorter and because, if I am honest, there was no evening when the path that passed the north tree line did not feel like the most direct route home, regardless of the actual geography. I saw the light in her yard from a distance, and then I saw Brav. He was enormous, as he always was, though somehow you forgot that in the memory, and had to relearn it each time in person. 200 stone of ancient wolf, silver-furred and deliberate, moving through the yard with the unhurried certainty of an animal that has never once in 2 centuries needed to hurry. The pups scattered before him, not in fear but in the instinctive deference of small wolves before a very old one, the automatic respect that is written into them before they understand what it means. And Saren stood at the door of her cottage with a lamp in her hand and watched him come. Brav stopped in the center of the yard. He looked at her. I reined in at the fence line, not dismounting, not making a sound. I do not think he was unaware of me. Nothing in those yellow eyes had ever been unaware of anything, but he did not acknowledge me. He was not looking at me. He was looking at her. Then, very slowly, with the deliberateness of an animal performing an act that has meaning, Brav lay down. He put his great silver head on his forepaws in the posture I had seen only in the paintings in Ashenveld's old gallery, in the depictions of the first Luna, the queen my grandfather had chosen, who had died before my father was grown. I had studied those portraits as a boy, trying to understand what it was the old books described, the wolf's acknowledgement, the oldest signal of acceptance the pack possessed, the gesture that could not be compelled or performed, and that Brav, in 2 centuries, had given to only one woman. He was giving it now to the woman standing in the lamplight with her hands still. Saren looked at him for a long moment. Then she crouched down, setting her lamp carefully on the ground beside her, and reached out a steady hand. Brav did not flinch. She laid her hand on the broad silver head, and he closed his eyes. I got off my horse. I don't remember making the decision. I remember the creak of the saddle and the cold ground under my boots, and then I was standing at the fence watching the woman I had been riding to see for 6 weeks, and I understood what I had been riding toward. Not a census. Not an administrative review, not the pups, who were a reason but not the reason. Her. The bond did not arrive like lightning. It arrived the way certainty arrives, quietly, filling a space you did not know was empty. Like knowing the name of something you have been looking at for a long time without a word for it. The something that had been opening in me slowly for 6 weeks, through every conversation at the fence line, and every ride home in the dark, through the way she said be careful on the north path, and the way she knew every wolf's name, and the way she looked at me as though she were genuinely glad I was there. It all gathered itself into a single clear recognition, and I stood in the cold, with that knowledge settling into me, and I thought, of course. Of course it is her. Saren looked up and saw me. In the lamplight, her face was calm and open, the way it always was, with no performance and no guard. She did not startle at finding me there. She said simply, "He came back." "Yes," I said. "He's been deciding something," she said, with that thoughtful directness she brought to observations about the wolves. "For months, I didn't know what." "I know what," I said. She looked at me steadily. "Tell me." I opened the gate. I crossed the yard to where she crouched beside Brav, and I crouched down too, so that we were level, with the old wolf's great head between us, and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. This close, I could see the steadiness in her, and the warmth in her, and the way she was looking at me. Not as her king, not with deference or with calculation, but as a person who had been paying attention to me the same way she paid attention to the wolves, genuinely, carefully, with all of her there. "The pack has been bringing you its orphaned wolves since spring," I said. "Every animal in need. You kept them. You moved twice rather than turn them away. Brav has been coming to look at you and look at the pups and make up his mind." I held her gaze. "He's the oldest wolf in Ashenveld, the oldest in the north. He acknowledged only one Luna in 2 centuries, the queen who is in the paintings in my East Gallery. He has not acknowledged anyone since." I paused. "He just acknowledged you." Seren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does that mean for you?" It was exactly the right question. Not what does that mean for me, not what does it mean for the pack or the council or the formal order of things. What does it mean for you? She had always been interested in the actual question rather than the ceremonial one. "It means," I said, "that I have been riding to this fence line for 6 weeks for a reason I was slow to name. And I should name it now." I looked at her in the lamplight, and there was nothing complicated in me, only a clarity I had not expected to find, here, in a yard full of sleeping pups in the cold. "You are my fated mate, Saren. My wolf has known it since the first morning. Brav has confirmed it in the oldest way I know. And I paused, finding the honest shape of the words. "I have been finding reasons to come here, because every time I ride away, something in me is already turning back." She listened to this the way she listened to everything, entirely, without hurry, without performance. Her hand was still resting on Brav's head. The wolf's yellow eyes were open now, watching us both with something that was not quite contentment and not quite satisfaction, but perhaps very close to both. The look of an animal who has been working patiently toward a conclusion and has finally arrived at it. "I'm not part of the pack," she said at last. "No standing, no name." "You are part of this pack," I said. "Every wolf in the North Range has decided so, one by one, over the course of a year. They've been more decisive about it than I was. A beat. I'm sorry it took me so long." Something shifted in her face. Not surprise, but the same soft landing quality I had seen when I told her the removal notices were dismissed. Something finding its rightful place. She looked at me and I saw it happen. The moment she let herself believe what she had perhaps been watching carefully for, not certain it was real. "You're not asking me to be anything I'm not," she said slowly. "You're asking me to come home." "Yes." She looked at Brav. Brav looked at nothing in particular, with the serene attention of a wolf who has completed a task he set himself long ago. "Then yes," she said. I brought her to the hold the next morning, which was not the way these things were usually done. Usually there was ceremony and preparation, and a formal presentation to the council in the great hall, with the pack assembled in the outer yard. But the pack already knew. There was not an animal in Ashenveld who had not been aware of what was happening at the tree line for the past 6 months, who had not been part of the long, quiet campaign that the wolves had been running in their patient, unhurried way. They did not require ceremony. The ceremony was for the men. Garvin was waiting in the great hall with 2 of the senior counselors, and the careful expression of a man assembling an objection he has already half decided to withdraw. I walked in with Saren beside me, and Brav 3 paces behind, which was not something I had arranged, and which I suspected Brav had arranged entirely himself, in the way that Brav arranged all things, with certainty and without asking permission. Garvin looked at Brav. He was not a man easily moved from his position, but Brav had a way of rearranging the terms of a conversation simply by being in the room. 200 stone of silver wolf, ancient as the forest, standing behind a woman with no pack affiliation, and a mending kit, and a yard full of orphaned pups. And every man in the hall understood, looking at the wolf's settled posture and his yellow eyes, that the decision had been made by something older and more certain than any of their objections. "My lord," Garvin began. "She has pack standing," I said. "Formally established as of last night, by the oldest living signal of acknowledgement this pack possesses." I glanced at Brav, who was sitting now, which in a wolf that size had something of a throne about it. "If you have a procedural objection to the word of a 200-year-old wolf, I am happy to hear it." Garvin was quiet. The two counselors beside him exchanged a look and chose, wisely, to remain quiet as well. "I thought not," I said. The hall was not silent in the way of stunned or resentful men. It was quiet in the way of men who have been moving in a direction and have just arrived at the destination, a quiet of completion rather than suppression. I had known these men and these wolves for most of my life, and I could feel in the room what I felt in myself, the sense that this was right, and that the understanding of rightness had been spreading outward through the pack long before it had reached the council table. Saren stood beside me with her hands still and her face composed. She was not performing composure, she simply was composed, in the way she was everything, from the center, not the surface. She looked at the hall around her, the stone columns, the long tables, the firelight, the assembled faces watching her with varying degrees of adjustment in their expressions, and I thought she was doing what she always did, taking in the relevant information carefully, without rushing to conclusions, reserving judgment until she had enough to work with. Then Brav walked forward. He moved through the hall at his own pace, past the council table and the fire, past the long row of Ashenveld's senior wolves who had come in quietly and were watching from the edges of the room. The wolves were still, the men were still. Brav did not hurry. He had not hurried in 200 years, and he did not hurry now. He walked to Saren, who turned toward him with the unhurried calm of a woman who has learned to take large things as they come, not because she did not feel them, but because she felt them deeply enough to be steady inside them. He stopped in front of her, looked at her with those old yellow eyes, and then he lowered his great silver head and rested it against her hand. The hall was still. Not the silence of shock, the silence of recognition. Every wolf in the room settled in the old posture of respect, the same one Brav had shown the night before in the yard. Not performed, not commanded, but given. The way all true things are given, because it was right, and they knew it was right, and there was nothing left to do but show it. One after another, quietly, without urgency, like stones settling into place. The counselors did not bow. They were men, not wolves, but they stood straighter, and Garvin's expression had settled at last from the labor of objection into something that was very nearly peace. Saren rested her hand on Brav's head and looked at me over the length of his silver back. "This is what I should have told you 6 weeks ago," I said to her, across the quiet hall. "The pack knew before I did. They brought the wolves to your door one by one, until the evidence was undeniable. Brav finished it. He's patient," she said. "He gave me time to get used to the idea." "Were you used to it?" She looked at me with those gray eyes that had been looking at me steadily and without performance since the first morning at the fence. "I knew what I felt," she said. "I was waiting to see if you would find your way to saying it." Quiet laughter moved through the hall, not at her expense but with her. The warm release of a thing that has been building for months and has finally been said aloud in a room full of people who were relieved to hear it. Dressed, at the back of the hall, looked at the ceiling with an expression of profound satisfaction. We were married at the winter turning, when the snow was deep and the wolves ran the outer forest in the old ceremony of acknowledgement that preceded every Luna's first season at Ashenveld. I will not describe the ceremony in detail. It was a cold and beautiful night, and there were a great many wolves, and Saren wore gray wool and did not seem at all bothered by the cold, which pleased me considerably. What I will say is this. When the ceremony concluded and the hall had settled into the warmth of the gathering afterward, the food and the fire and the voices, the pups who had come in from the yards to investigate the celebration, Saren's 17 orphans, now indistinguishable from the rest of the pack in the way that comfortable animals blend back into their world, I found her standing near the East Gallery, looking at the portrait of the first Luna. "Is that her?" she said. "Brav's Luna." "Yes." She studied the portrait for a while. It was very old. The paint had darkened over the centuries, and the woman in it was only a shape, and a suggestion of a face, and an expression that might have been steadiness, or warmth, or both. But the wolf beside her was Brav, unmistakable even across 2 centuries of paint, with those yellow eyes that had not changed. "She looks quiet," Saren said. "The records describe her that way," I said. "Steadfast, not one for ceremony." Saren nodded, considering this. Then she said, "How long did Brav wait, after she died?" "The records don't say," I said, "but the portrait was made in the 7th year of my grandfather's reign, and he reigned for 40 years after that." I paused. "He has been waiting a long time." She was quiet, looking at the painting. Then she said softly, "And the whole time, he was certain it would come." "Yes," I said, "I think he was." She turned from the portrait to look at me, and her face in the firelight was warm and open and wholly present. The same face she had turned toward me across a yard full of sleeping pups on a cold autumn morning when I had ridden out to count wolves and found, instead, the reason I had been restless for a year. "He was very sure about you," I told her. "He was sure before I was," she said, "and before you were." She smiled. The quiet, unhurried smile she gave to things that struck her as exactly right. "I'm glad he was patient with both of us." I took her hand, the way I had been wanting to take her hand for 6 weeks, and the way I meant to take it for the rest of my life. Her hand was warm and steady in mine, as it always was. In the yard outside, through the thick stone walls, I could hear the pack running. Not in alarm, in celebration, the long howl of wolves who have been waiting for something and have finally heard it arrive. Brav raised his head from the fire and listened, and his yellow eyes were calm, and then he laid his great silver head back down with the slow deliberateness of an animal at complete rest. He had done his work. The pack had a Luna, and the pups that had been making their nightly journey to a small stone cottage at the tree line all through the long year, the 17 orphans who had come one by one to a woman who never turned any of them away, were home. As was I, as was she. He had known it before any of us. He had only needed to bring us there.